This evening I'm very pleased to introduce you to Peter Doherty, Laureate Professor of Microbiology and Immunology at the University of Melbourne. Peter was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1996 and the Australian of the Year in 1997, and I think Order of Australia, was it, in 1997 also. His honours, when I counted them up during the week when I was doing some searching on him for tonight, I counted 46 awards, fellowships and honours that he has. Big pardon? Yeah, well, he's a very much rewarded person. These include the Fellow of the Royal Society of London, National Academy of Sciences, USA, and a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Sciences. I guess they stand out as 3 there, out of those 46. He currently holds 16 honorary degrees from various universities around Australia. And I'm tempted to refer to Peter as Queenslander, but I guess that's where he started his life cycle, but he's been everywhere since. That's why I say tempted. He graduated from the University of Queensland as a vet, and that was his introduction to his interest in immunology and virology. He then attended Edinburgh University for his PhD on virus infection of sheep. And upon his return to Australia, he took up a postdoctoral position with the John Curtin School of Medical Research. And it was there that he, with his colleague, in 73-74, did his most famous research, which resulted in his Nobel Prize. During his career, of course, Peter's done many other things, some of which I've picked out here, which are that he works still with St Jude's Hospital in Memphis, USA, which I think specialises in children's activities, yes. And he's obviously worked with many other institutions around the world. He's given long-term service to the International Laboratory for Research on Animal Diseases in Kenya. And he's spent time in Africa and Southeast Asia promoting the immunisation for major diseases like AIDS and malaria. And somehow amongst all that life and busy activities that he's been, I guess lots of people putting demands on his time, he's found time to write 2 books. At least I've sharpened up tonight that it is 2 books at this stage. There was a few others in the process in his mind, I think. But The Life History of Air and The Beginner's Guide to Winning the Nobel Prize, which I've enjoyed reading. I must admit that the last of those 2 titles I did not read for the purpose of ambition. In 1965, Peter married Penny, who's amongst us here in the audience. He is obviously a resident of Melbourne now and lives not very far from here. Penny and Peter have 2 sons. And this being the centenary year of the Graduate Union, as most of you are aware, we decided to use the theme of leadership as the theme for our year. And so Peter is going to weave that theme into his presentation tonight. So therefore I'd like to, I should say also the reason we chose leadership is that we at Graduate House say, well, okay, we are an organisation who provides accommodation for graduate students, so they obviously go on to bigger and better things, and they will be leaders in the community and the world in the future, this sort of people. So we think that we have a role here to further assist our residents to be the leaders in the future. So that's the choice of leadership. So please join me in welcoming Peter to the rostrum for his presentation.
Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to be here. I didn't realise I was talking on leadership until a couple of weeks ago. We came back from Europe, I think, and Penny opened the Melbourne Age and she said, "Do you realise you're talking on leadership?" And I think it was because the series was on leadership, and my talk's called Leadership because I didn't duck in time and invent another title. So that was quite intimidating. Then I thought about it a bit, and I thought what I'd do is actually ramble on a bit about leadership and the sense, in different senses, because I think leadership comes in all sorts of different forms and in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. I am a Queenslander. You can take the boy out of Queensland, but you can never take the Queensland out of the boy. No pennies trying. And we also have 6 grandchildren, which is one of the reasons I'm particularly interested in issues like education and also in issues like anthropogenic climate change and what we're doing to our environment generally. And those ideas and arguments, I think, are tremendously important. It's a tremendously important discussion for us to have, and it's tremendously important for us to act on some of these things. So, leadership. St Jude was mentioned. St Jude Children's Research Hospital is actually the biggest paediatric oncology hospital in the world. It's based in Memphis, Tennessee, for very odd reasons. And this is a story of leadership, if you like, from a very unlikely cause, or a very unlikely source. The hospital was actually started by a TV comedian and entertainer, a Hollywood TV comedian and entertainer called Danny Thomas. Do you remember Danny Thomas? Yeah, this generation can probably remember Danny Thomas. He also has a daughter, Marlo Thomas, who's my age really, and is still playing around the place, and has taken Danny's role because Danny's passed over into the shades. But Danny was he grew up in Detroit as son of Lebanese Syrian immigrants, Christian Arab community really, and a lot of those people came into the United States through the early part of the 20th century, and they've been enormously successful, and they're really very fine people. But he decided he was going to be an entertainer, and he married a very attractive lady, and he had a couple of little kids, and he really wasn't making it as an entertainer, and he was deeply religious, Maronite Catholic, and went along to the cathedral. He put his last dollar into the thing in front of the statue of St Jude, who was the patron saint of hopeless causes. And he prayed to St Jude that if he was successful, he would do something in the name of St Jude. And the very next day, at least this is the myth, I'm not sure if it's true, because this is Hollywood, you know, we're talking Hollywood. And the very next day he got a job as a singing toothbrush on a TV commercial. And he never looked back. And he went to Hollywood and became very successful. He had a TV series called That's Daddy, and his daughter Marlo was in another series called That Girl. Every American male of my age at some time was in love with Marlo Thomas. And then he produced some wonderful intellectual television like Mr. Ed the Talking Horse and Gilligan's Island. And then he thought about his vow, and he went back and he talked to the Archbishop of Chicago, who later became Cardinal Strict. And he said, what should I do in the name of St. Jude? I've been enormously successful, and this is a very American story. I've been enormously successful. What do I do? What do you think I should do? And the Cardinal said, well, why don't you go down to Memphis, Tennessee and think about starting a children's hospital? Because the Cardinal, as a young priest, had been in Memphis, which is a very poor city. It's taken a lot of the agricultural workers off the old cotton plantations when they started mechanical cotton picking. And why don't you think about starting a children's hospital? He went down there, talked to the local people. They had no interest in starting a children's hospital. They had 2, one for blacks, one for whites. But he met a hematologist, a research hematologist called Lemuel K. Diggs. Only an American could have a name called Lemuel K. Lemuel was a very fine man, and he took him to the idea of a research hospital. Started in 1962, tiny place, and they were enormously successful very rapidly. And the reason they were successful is they went after the principal pediatric cancer, which was acute lymphoblastic leukemia, with a very aggressive chemotherapy and radiation and so forth, under the first director, a man called Don Pinkel. And they did that against the current opinion. Because those treatments were not working well in adults, people said we should not put children through that. But these were days when you didn't have to have all the approvals that you have to have now. Ethics approval was a very different process. And they went ahead and did it, and it was enormously successful. And it turns out you can treat those cancers in kids really quite successfully. The death rate was up in the 90%, It's now down around 15% or something like that, the residual problem. Now that hospital has gone on and it's been very successful. It's brought the death rates from a lot of cancers down. It's part of the Children's Oncology Group, which also includes our fine hospital here, the Children's Hospital, Sydney and so forth. It's an international thing. Kids' cancers are fairly rare. They do trials right across the spectrum, US, Australia, and all the rest of it. And because it was successful, and because they did this very quickly, the whole Hollywood apparatus got in behind them. With Elizabeth Taylor was involved, a lot of those early stars, Robin Williams has been involved more recently, John Goodman, various others of the movie stars, and it's just raised enormous amounts of money. It raises more than $500 million a year in public subscription. Can you imagine? Public, that's before you get research grants, and it's right up there. It's one of the best employers in America. It's in the top 2 or 3 of the best scientific employers in America, and it's got 3 members of the National Academy of Science. Incredibly successful institution in a most unlikely place. And that's leadership. That's leadership, and it came from Danny Thomas. And what did he do? Well, firstly, he had an idea. Secondly, he talked to the right person. Thirdly, he followed through on it. And then he did 2 things which were very important. Firstly, the obvious one was to involve the Hollywood community. And he's a much loved guy. He was a producer and just a generally nice guy. And also told dirty jokes and did all the things that people appreciated. And never quite understood just how well behaved he was and something. They loved to party, these guys. But the other thing he did was he involved what he called his brothers, which was actually his brothers and sisters. What he did is he involved the American, Lebanese, Syrian, they're really Syrians actually, Lebanon's just a creation that was cut out of Syria, and by the British and the French for dubious reasons. Anything to do with the British and French is likely to be dubious, and between them and with them together. And basically he involved his brothers, who were very successful lawyers, businessmen, all sorts of people, and they formed the fundraising committee with a great deal of astuteness about how to raise money and many great contacts. And if you think of the comparable group, which they're actually very similar as a group, and I'm mixed with a lot of them, is the American Jewish group. They're very similar. I mean, they're brothers, these people, actually. They're Semitic in that part of the world. And while the Jewish community had all these outlets for philanthropy, Albert Einstein University, Yeshiva Medical School, National Jewish Hospital in Denver, Colorado, and so forth. There was nothing on the Arab side, and they set up St. Jude. And now they have 3rd-generation people on their board. Just about drives the director mad, but they raise a lot of money. And so that's leadership, I think, in coming from an unlikely source. Now, other types of leadership, well, you know, I can't tell any stories like a general can lead. Generals do lead. I mean, I don't have any crocodile stories. Maybe General Jeffrey had a great crocodile story, but I've never met a crocodile up close and never wanted to. It's sort of been very unpleasant to be eaten by a large reptile. I don't know why it would be better to be eaten by a large mammal, but if you use a large reptile, does seem particularly awful. Leadership. Well, I'll tell you a bit of a story about what we've done this year, because I think it exemplifies some issues, and I'll tell it from the point of view of leadership, insofar as that is. We've done 3 European trips this year for various reasons. It's not unusual, and we've combined a lot of different things together. And the first one we did early in the year is we went to Stockholm to a Nobel Symposium on Sustainability. This was the 3rd Nobel Symposium on Sustainability. And it's basically climate change, sustainability, problems of population and all the rest of it, trying to discuss these things and come up with some reasonable resolution. I didn't quite know what it was about. My world's not diplomacy. And as with most of us, I mean, we don't live in the world of diplomats. That's Kevin's world. And so we turned up in Stockholm. It was the 3rd of these meetings. The first of them had been held in Potsdam some 6 years or so back, organised by Johann Schellenhuber, who heads the Potsdam Institute. Germany has really done probably more than any country on the climate change mitigation, developing new technology type front. It's taken it very seriously. They've done a great deal. They have a lot of solar power. Can you imagine in Germany, a lot of solar power? They've even talked about taking over a large hunk of the Sahara to put in solar collectors and pipe the electricity back up to Northern Europe, which is quite a feat actually, and very demanding. So the first one was in Potsdam, and the idea behind it is if you bring a lot of Nobel Prize winners together, they've got some sort of prestige, and this helps people get interested. I'm not convinced personally. When we bring a lot of old Nobel Prize winners together, okay, but you know, they get Alzheimer's disease at the same rate as anybody else. As I'm discovering. Anyway, so that was the first one. The second one was sponsored by our future king, Prince Charles, and at St James Palace. And you know, the Prince is very committed to this issue, and that's great. He's also committed to some other greeny issues which are a bit wacky, but anyway, I think he's a nice man actually. If we're going to have a king, why not have him? He's okay. And so that was at St James Palace. And then the third one, the formal sponsor was the King of Sweden, who's quite a nice king. He's the only king I've met, and his daughter, the princess, who will be the next king, the queen, was there. Like the Commonwealth, they've just changed the regulations some years back so that the eldest child will succeed. So it will be the princess who succeeds. And they both spoke. They came to the thing, and it was all very formal, and we were all jumping up and down every time the king walks in. You always stand up for a king, and so forth. And we all signed a memorandum. It was very orchestrated, actually. I found it rather strange because, you know, as a scientist, I'm used to a lot of discussion and debate. There really wasn't a lot of discussion and debate. It was rather formal, and they really put this thing together. It made sense, and we all signed on to it in a very formal way. We met at the. We stayed in a very funky hotel right down on the waterfront. You could look out and see the palace next to the Grand Hotel where you stay when you win the Nobel Prize. And this one, when we came into it, Penny and I came in a couple of days early because we were flying from Australia. We wanted to have a bit of a break. And it was full of very strange people. It was full of, I think they had to do with the rock music industry and fashion, and they were all very, very trendy and funky and so forth, and not the sort of stuffy people we're used to being around. And then they threw them all out, and all these Nobel Prize winners came in. And we felt very much more familiar territory. So we spent the time there. And then the meeting was out at the Swedish Academy of Science. I hadn't been there before. The Swedish Academy of Science, the people that select the Nobel Prize winners in physics and in chemistry. So Brian Schmidt this year, for instance, would have been selected through deliberations at the Swedish Academy of Science. It was quite interesting to sort of go into their big reading room, and there's little slips of paper with "Ja, Nej" on it. So maybe that's how they vote, you know, because they never talk about how they do this thing. When we got out there, we were confronted by a bunch of protesters. These were the Lyndon LaRouche guys. Do you know about Lyndon LaRouche? Lyndon LaRouche is a long-term prominent American nut. He's run for president. I think he's been in prison. He has an opinion about everything, and he has a following around the world. And these guys were handing out things accusing us all of practicing genocide. Genocide? I mean, we're here to try and discuss how we do something about global sustainability. And you know, the climate change was part of the thing, environmental degradation, all the rest of it. And genocide, and we weren't talking about genocide as far as I can see. But these guys believe that the whole climate issue is simply a ploy to conduct genocide in the developing world. And not only that, it's actually organised by Queen Elizabeth II. I'm serious. Now we know it's not Queen Elizabeth II, it's Prince Philip, right? Can you believe it? So anyway, we got past these guys and we had our discussion. And then at the end we signed that thing, and then I finally realised what the whole thing was about. So the Highpowered committee comes from the UN, and it's basically doing a UN report or a UN action on climate change, and there's all these guys, well-known names and so on, including, of course, our Kevin, who's, as one might imagine, one of the most vocal and effective people on the committee. Whenever Kevin's there, you know he's there. And they received our report, which I thought was kind of mundane in a way, because this whole stuff had been said over and over again, it had been publicised over and over again, and here we are just signing on again to the same thing. But they received this thing and they said, isn't this wonderful, it's fantastic, it makes our job so much easier. And I didn't believe a word of it, but hopefully that's presumably what it was about. So leadership, well, Sheldon has provided a lot of leadership on this issue. The local thing was organised by Johan Rockström. I met some people who've actually done a whole lot to try and raise consciousness on various issues, including Paul Crutzen, who's one of the guys who got the Nobel Prize in chemistry, I think it was, for the ozone hole. And he's very concerned that the world's running out of phosphate, actually. That's evidently a big issue. You know, the world is nitrogen. Much of the world is nitrogen deficient, including including and particularly Africa, and phosphate is going to be an enormous issue for us. Yeah. So we discussed a lot of things, and it was really pretty interesting stuff. So that was that event. Now from Stockholm, we then went to Paris, back-to-back meetings. This was a meeting on global hunger, and it was at the Collège de France, which is right in the University of the Sorbonne. And so we stayed in a hotel called La Place des Grands Hommes, and we looked out on the Place du Panthéon and the Pantheon itself. I meant to look up who's buried in the Pantheon, but I didn't. I forgot. I said, does anyone know who's in the Pantheon? There must be a lot of leaders that are dead in there. Not Napoleon, I know that. And not Louis Pasteur.
Madame Curie.
Is Madame Curie there?
Yes.
Okay, well, she was definitely a leader. Yeah.
Alexandria Dumas.
Okay. Yeah. Dumas defended, was he the one that defended...
No, Emile Zola.
Yeah, so, okay. Yeah, anyway, it was intriguing to be there. And all the students all sit around in the Place du Panthéon. So, you know, University of Paris, leading institution. I think Cambridge started as a college of the University of Paris, is that right? I think it did, you know. Or Oxford, one of the two. Oxford's the old, isn't it? You know. And then, of course, the College of France. And there's another example of leadership. That was started by Francois I in about 1530, and he started the Collège de France as an institution of learning and research and so forth that was independent of the church, because the universities at that stage were pretty much run by the church. And that was a movement that was happening at that stage. It was the breakaway university of Padua, which was actually started by students, where they really started to do human anatomy. And that's where Harvey, for instance, did his work on the circulation of the blood. Up till Harvey, we believed that blood ebbed and flowed. That was Galen's idea, and that was firmly embedded in medicine, which was one of the reasons why it was perfectly reasonable to bleed people, to take the bad blood out, because it was ebbing and flowing. But when it's circulating, it's not such a good idea. It's depleted. But so there is another example of leadership, and really the College of France at the time it was set up so that any person could walk off the street and attend the lectures. There's no fee and there's no bar, and that's still the case. If you have a meeting at the College of France, anyone can walk off the street and come in and sit in the audience, which is kind of intriguing. Now, this meeting was organised by a man called Ismail Serageldin. Now, I've known Ismail for a number of years. He started life as an Egyptian diplomat, and I first met him when he was the head within the World Bank of the funding organisation for what we call the Consultative Group for International Agriculture Research. Now, the Consultative Group for International Agriculture Research is a mechanism that's funded by various countries on a sort of voluntary basis, backed up by the World Bank, that funds a lot of agricultural institutes around the world. I think there was something like 23 at the peak number. I think they're maybe now down to about 19 or so. And I was involved with this because my training was initially as a vet, and I was a board member for the Institute for the International Laboratory for Research on Animal Disease in East Africa and Kenya, which was working on 2 diseases of cattle, trypanosomiasis and East Coast fever. And I was going out there 2 or 3 times a year as part of my function on the board, and as a result was going to the International Agriculture thing in Washington at the World Bank, which is where I met Serageldin. Now, the CGIAR, which funded, for example, the research institute CIMMIT in Mexico, which is where Norman Borlaug, who did the work that led to his being awarded the Nobel Prize for the Green Revolution, was working. And Borlaug provided very strong leadership right up until his death at a pretty advanced age, trying to improve and enhance agricultural production throughout the world. Borlaug was a great advocate for GM technology, which of course brought him into many conflicts with various people, particularly for use of that in Africa and so forth. He's a very fine man, and really it was a privilege to meet him, really. And he'd come from a working, practicing scientist background to really become a leading figure in this global effort. Now, the CGIAR itself is again an example of leadership of 2 different types, and it was 2 people who got together to really get this going. One was Robert McNamara, the former US Secretary of State. Now, McNamara's history is not unscathed, if you like. I mean, he was involved in some things that didn't work out too well in the military sense, but he got together with our own Sir John Crawford, who was really the executive who made this thing work and set up the model. Crawford, as you may know, former Vice-Chancellor of the Australian University, but before that, he was a government bureaucrat. He was one of the 7 dwarves. There were these guys in Canberra, in the sort of Menzies era, really, and a bit after, they were all evidently vertically challenged. They were very effective bureaucrats, and they did a lot to sort of set Australia on course, and Crawford set this up. One of the reasons I was at this meeting and met Serageldin was that I was giving this John Crawford lecture, and which was an interesting experience. Now, Serageldin then went back to Egypt to become the first head of the reconstructed Grand Library of Alexandria. Now, the Grand Library of Alexandria was the first international accumulation of learning from about 320 BC to about 240 BC. Alexandria was founded in the name of Alexander the Great, who was, of course, Greek. But Alexandria was really part of the Greek sphere of influence, so it's in North Africa. And Alexander died before he ever went to Alexandria. He went there dead, actually. They had him on display for quite some time, admittedly. And Alexandria, of course, was also the site of the Great Lighthouse, which is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and all the rest of it. But the Great Library of Alexandria, under Ptolemy I and II, they brought together all the manuscripts, parchments, and papyruses, really, from the ancient world. Everything from Greece and from Rome, and all the learning accumulated there. And it became almost the first university, in fact, because people would go there and they would study medicine and so forth. So it was the first thing we ever had that approximated the university. It came apart when Julius Caesar accidentally burned it in some sort of power play, and then it progressively became degraded. Under the Christian emperor Theodosius I, he wasn't too keen on open exchange and ideas, as sometimes has happened in some religious bodies, and it was damaged through that, and then it was terminated. It really became terminal under the Muslims. So a great amount of knowledge was lost, and we don't know what was lost. There was no record, there was no catalogue, and so we really don't know what we've missed from those ancient times. So under the Mubaraks, Mrs. Mubarak in fact, was a sponsor of the idea that they should re-establish the Great Library. And there's a wonderful new building which is very elaborate. They've been putting books and all sorts of innovative things in. They've done a lot with training young Egyptians and bringing them in to do science experiments, the sort of thing you do in any good science museum, really, with kids, and terrific. But there's a real concern, and that is that at the moment the library is actually occupied. It's occupied by some of the workers in the library who want more money, but they also want the great hall of the library, the big open space, turned into a mosque. Now, you know, maybe what's happened in the Middle East is great, but I think we should all be concerned. And basically, we hope this situation is going to be brought to a close. But it was defended under the previous government, and it probably doesn't have the strong defenders that it did have. Now, Serageldin, why was he organising this meeting in the College of France? Well, they made him a professor of the College of France. They take certain prominent individuals who they think are doing very important things, and they give them a short-term professorship as sort of an honorary fellowship sort of thing. So that allowed him to organise a meeting there. He was organising this meeting on hunger because he wanted to bring a lot of the science out into the open, to discuss this problem from a scientific perspective. But we also had, there were 2 Nobel Prize winners there. I was a bit intimidated talking on world hunger, really, because it's, you know, I work on influenza. It's not really quite my thing, but I managed to pace my way through it with the help of Snow Barlow and the guys in the agriculture faculty. But the other Nobel Prize winner he had there was Boy Soyinka, the Nigerian author, who actually stood up. He'd written a story for the thing, and he stood up and read it, which was just fantastic, actually, very impressive. So it was very interesting. What was it all about? Well, basically what he was trying to do was to get the French to live up their obligations for international aid. It was just before the group of 8, I think it was, and he had the French delegate there, and he was trying to give ammunition, I think. Because what happens with these aid agencies, and if you ask our own aid agencies as well, they get promised vast amounts of money. They're lucky to get 60%. And particularly governments are not very open about this. I mean, they promise money, but then it turns out to be in-kind donations, or everything has to be carried on a US carrier or something. I mean, so it's not so great. So that's what the whole thing was about. Well, from there, as one does, we got on a plane and went to Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, I was back in my own world, which we were having a meeting on influenza. It was what's called the Keystone meeting. The Keystone conferences were conferences that were set up in the United States back in the 60s by a group of academics in the University of California. And they've actually been the great discussion point for biomedical research, all areas of biomedical research over the last 50 years or so, and still continue to be so. They used to always be in ski resorts in winter. Now, we used to go there and you'd work all morning, then ski all afternoon, and then you'd work again at night. Well, some of us got too old for that anyway. But also what's happened is, you know, the ski space in the middle of the day has been more and more contracted with more and more scientific stuff. It's one of the ways that American socialism works, basically. American socialism all goes towards business. You know, the armaments business, subsidies for agriculture, but also this is a way of subsidising hotels and ski resorts in the off-season, because they actually end up paying a lot of the costs for people to go there. Very powerful. This one's in Hong Kong. It's in Hong Kong because of influenza. Hong Kong is the meeting place of East and West, and most influenza viruses actually come out of China because they come out, the novel ones, they come out of birds, possibly going through pigs and then into humans. And where you've got warm conditions, a lot of water birds, because they're maintaining water birds, you get these things mixing, and you get novel influenza viruses coming out. So the latest one we've experienced, of course, came from Mexico, where 2 pig viruses got together. So there's a great influenza group in Hong Kong. It was started by an Australian called Ken Shortridge, who went up there and built at the University of Hong Kong. And then when the 1997 bird flu hit, and we had a lot of people die from influenza, the Americans got very concerned, as we all did. You know, we were so worried about the bird flu pandemic, and they put a lot of money in, And the leadership there came from Tony Fauci at the US National Institutes of Health, and it's led by a man called Malik Peres. He's an FARS, he's Portuguese, trained in England, now works in Hong Kong. We've just sent one of our brightest young people up there to work in that program. There is another incentive. She's married to a Cathay Pacific pilot, but still, she was pretty pleased to go up there. So we had a very good meeting and talked lots of times. Then we came back again. And I haven't got, I've only got 10 minutes to cover the rest of it. So then managed to settle down and do a bit more work on my book, which is currently being edited by Melbourne University Publishing. I wanted to call it Sentinel Chickens, but we're having a debate. The marketing people don't like that. It could end up as feathered friends or feathers or something. I don't know. So anyway, look for it next year, everyone. Then our next trip, we had two things to do. The first thing was to go to a meeting on the lung at the University of Gießen, the Justus Liebig University. And you would think that because I work on influenza and because I trained in pathology and so forth, I'd know all about the lung. But actually the problem with science is we're now also specialised that it's very divided, and we're all in separate compartments. And I'd never been to a lung meeting, a real lung meeting. These were people who were interested in things like hypertension and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and the physiology of the lung. So I was learning a lot of things that I'd never heard before. The meeting itself was in a schloss. It wasn't a real schloss, it was a fake 19th century schloss. And it was hideous. It was this massive construct that some very wealthy businessman had built. And it was over ornate, and there was these horrible carvings and everything. And it wasn't exactly a surprise to say the Nazis had used it extensively during World War II. And nobody actually told us what the Nazis had used it for, which I think I'm rather glad they didn't. But when the Americans took over, they didn't give it back to the original owners because of how it had been used, and they gave it to the university. So it's actually a university meeting centre. It was a very interesting meeting, and we met a leader in the world of respiratory physiology, a man called John B. West. John B. West is an Adelaide physician. He was the founding chair of medicine at the University of California, San Diego, and also he was the doctor on the second Hillary expedition, which is, I think, the one when they climbed Everest. He said he was never allowed to go all that high because he was too old already. And I learned a lot about respiratory physiology from him. He wrote the standard textbook on respiratory medicine. So if you talk to medical doctors, most of them have studied West's book on respiratory medicine. Evidently, if you want to climb Everest, there's several things you need to know. The first is that the people who are most likely to be able to climb Everest successfully are not necessarily the absolute fittest, they're the people who hyperventilate naturally. If you do that naturally, you do best at very high altitude. When you think about it, even though you've got oxygen and so forth, if you're hyperventilating when you're sleeping and just doing it naturally, it's helping you to oxygenate because you're getting to very, very low oxygen levels. And so that's what gets people up Everest. And he said the other thing is that everyone who climbs Everest, whether they use oxygen or not, comes down with some degree of permanent brain damage, which is a little bit worrying. But yeah. Anyway, he led another expedition to Everest with later an American science expedition. Did a lot of measurements on top of. They did a lot of measurements on top of Everest. He didn't go to the top, but they did a lot of measurements and got a lot of really good data out of it. Showed some pictures which are a bit disconcerting. I mean, he shows this picture of what looks like a climber ahead of him, all clad in gear and stuff, and said, he's been dead for 5 years, and they're just sort of frozen in there. I think someone's going to clean out some of the bodies on Everest, but there's a lot of them.
Yeah, there are.
Yeah, so the other interesting thing is I was currently working on this bird book, is that bar-headed geese can fly over the top of Everest. No trouble at all. So, and I've been looking at the bird lung. I won't go into detail because it'd be sort of boring, but and you can read my book. But the bird lung is not like ours. Our lungs end in the alveoli, these sacs, and we breathe in and out. And we're always mixing inspired and expired air. The bird, by the use of the air sacs, actually a flow-through lung. There are no terminal alveoli. And the way it works is the air sac, when it breathes in, some goes straight into the lung, some goes into an air sac separately. And when they breathe out, fresh air comes back in through the air sac. So they're always breathing fresh air. So they're incredibly efficient at using oxygen, which is why they can actually fly over the top of Everest. Talking to John West at the age of 84, he's still researching, and he's actually researching the bird lung. And what he found is that because you've got this structure, whether it's just a tube that's the lung air interface, it's not like the alveoli. It can be structured very rigidly, which means you can have a very thin epithelial cell layer, the one that separates the blood and the air, which means you can get much better crossing over the oxygen. So it's a classic case of how evolution has gone one way in the mammals and one way in the birds. There's a lot of this actually. I mean, the birds have an immune system that does everything our immune system does, but it does it rather differently. But it works pretty much as well. And this respiratory thing is, of course, peculiar to the birds. Though some of the dinosaurs may also have had it at sort, because they have spaces for air sacs in their bones, evidently, and there weren't that many flying dinosaurs. So I think also a lot of dinosaurs I now realise have feathers. I don't know what this has got to do with leadership. But we went from Keystone to Rome. And the occasion in Rome was that I'd been asked, as I'm the only person who has a veterinary training who's won a Nobel Prize, I've been asked to speak briefly at the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization General Assembly. FAO is based in Rome, on the occasion of the eradication of rinderpest. We've eradicated 2 viruses from the planet. One is smallpox, and that was led by Frank Fenner from Adelaide, eminent Australian medical scientist and geneticist, who also was the scientist who oversaw what happened with the myxomatosis introduction. That was Dame Jean McNamara, of course, was the person who really pushed to get that done. She sounds a wonderful woman. Unfortunately, a lot of the people you'd like to meet is dead, but I would like to meet her. She sounds very feisty. And really pushed and fought to get the myxomatosis thing done. But Frank actually oversaw that. And then that's a pox virus, and then smallpox, of course, is a pox virus. He was the chair of the World Health Organization committee that oversaw the eradication of smallpox. And he and 2 other people, Henderson and Arita, received the Japan Prize for that work. And so that was done back in the 1970s. And this is the second virus that's ever been eradicated, rinderpest. And that was done by the combination of use of vaccine and by some very smart science and some very dedicated people who led this thing. And working with WHO is a pretty good organisation from the point of view of an international organisation. All these UN organisations have problems because they have to have representation from all sorts of countries. They don't necessarily control people who are appointed to them and so forth. WHO, I think, works considerably better than FAO, but that's just an opinion. And I did get to speak in the General Assembly. It was like the General Assembly of the United Nations, and just said congratulations, and that's great. And it really was the people out in the field who led this. It was the FAO people, they're very dedicated. People from the OIE, the Organisation on International Des Epizootiques, which is also responsible for this type of area, based in Paris, and even more dysfunctional than FAO, I think. And also a lot of field people, state veterinary officers in the African countries who really made this happen, because it was a matter of eradicating it from Africa in the end. It had been eradicated from Europe, it had been pushed out of Europe many, many years back by proper agricultural practices and vaccination. But it was a tremendous impost in Europe in the 19th century. In fact, it was one of the reasons the veterinary profession got going as a scientific profession and moved on from just being horse doctors and farriers and that sort of thing. The other thing about rinderpest, though, is it's a virus that has diverged from human measles about 10,000 years back. 12,000 years back, in fact. So it's, no, 1,200 years back, not 10,000, 1,200 years back. it didn't, that long after agriculture really got going. And so it's kind of salutary that rinderpest, which is a veterinary disease, and which also established in wildlife, it was in the wildebeest, and people were very worried that they wouldn't be able to eradicate it because it was in the wildebeest and they would just seed it back into the cattle. But it turned out the cattle were seeding it to the wildebeest, and the wildebeest weren't the primary maintaining host for it. But it's intriguing that we've been able to eradicate rinderpest, but we can't eradicate measles. And the reason measles is pretty much eradicated from Australia, but we get measles outbreaks. Why do we get measles outbreaks? Because people come in with measles from the advanced Western countries where a substantial proportion of people will not vaccinate their kids. And people are catching measles when they shouldn't get it. They've done the same thing has happened. People from Switzerland have reintroduced measles into South American countries where it's been largely eradicated. So we've got to change people's attitudes if we're going to eradicate things like measles. And so that brings me to probably, I guess, the last issue I'll say something about. Have I been going for 45 minutes now? No. Oh, well, I got hours for this. You know, you put a Nobel Prize winner up, they'll talk forever. It's a matter of whether they're still making sense of it. Okay, all right, I'm reassured. Yeah, so science communication, I think, is becoming an enormous challenge. Science, as you know, has been under some degree of attack because it's threatening a lot of powerful interests because of the climate change thing. And there's kind of an attack on science in the United States, both from the climate change point of view, also from the creationist point of view. And it's kind of disturbing. And though at the moment I noticed, I looked at I was looking in Nature, and I think it's the US Senate that said they want to put another $1 billion into the National Institutes of Health a year, which is great. I mean, it's getting 30+ billion a year, but another $1 billion. And so, you know, if creationists thought about it, a lot of the data that says creationism has to be crazy comes from medical research. I work on influenza viruses. They're the classic example of Darwinian evolution. You put them in the presence of antibody, they select, they change. So I've never heard a creationist claim either influenza or HIV for their story. It would be an interesting discussion, I must have. But scientific education, and in fact getting good quality information across is becoming increasingly difficult. We've all seen the erosion of the daily newspapers that's happened. They've got fall off in advertising, fall off in sales, and some of them are catering to very niche markets, like the Australian, for instance, that can really be pretty rigid. And it's a problem. And so what's been started, and it started at the University of Melbourne, and the person who's led this is Andrew Jaspin, the former editor of The Age, is a new thing called The Conversation. So take out your ballpoints or your quill pens or whatever, and the conversation.edu.au, the conversation one word.edu.au. What this is, it's sponsored at the moment by the group of 8 universities, or most of the group of 8, and also by a number of the other universities who are paying some money into this. Federal government has put money in, and I think state governments, I don't know if it's actually put it in, or it's probably going to put it in. And also we've got a lot of support from Commonwealth Bank. What it is that academics or people with specialist knowledge and so forth can register with the conversation. They get registered, they declare all the conflicts of interest. So whatever they write appears, it's a blog, appears with their statement of conflict of interest. And they're asked to write, or they volunteer to write on different subjects. And they try to get, Jasmine's a newsman, so if there's something controversial and interesting, or for instance, the discussion at the moment of cross-reactive flu vaccines, I've just written something for that. They wrote a whole thing on climate change, they're doing a whole thing on science and how it's understood and how it's done and so forth at the moment. And so they do these series, it's coming out several times a week. The stuff is written frequently by academics, and then though, it goes through a professional newsroom. These are the former people from The Age, various other newspapers, one's American, and they rewrite and put it in language that reasonable people can understand. And it bounces backward and forward. Yeah. So it's actually pretty good and pretty readable, I think. It's being picked up. It's there to be picked up by newspapers. It's getting into Google News, and various other sites. It's going international. It's only been going for months, and it's going like that. And I think it's still evolving, and it's a very worthwhile site. So I think this, I've thought for a long time that the electronic media has to be the answer to what's happening with communication, because the visual media is also letting us down pretty badly. For instance, when Lord Monckton was here, the wacko, the ABC had him on, I think, 25 times. When Hansen was here, the head of the big climate science group at Colorado, which is one of the leading groups in the world, I think he was on 4 or 5 times. Schellenhuber, the guy that organised the meeting in Stockholm that I went to, was out here. I don't think he was on at all. I don't think anybody talked to him.
Very, very short.
Very short. But he also had the Lyndon LaRouche people. He came out here for a meeting just after we got back. There was a meeting here. I went along to it, and there were the Lyndon LaRouche people outside. But when he started to speak, one of them stood up with a noose. You remember that?
No.
Yeah, that's about the only publicity he got, was the noose. They threw that person out, and then they had to throw 3 more out as they stood up. And, you know, it's all due to Queen Elizabeth II. So that was our second trip for the year. Our third trip for the year, we went to Malta for the European Influenza meeting. I was giving the opening keynote, I think. That was an interesting meeting because it's a meeting that's focused much more around practical outcomes, a lot of representation from people in the drug and vaccine industry, and a lot of people there from the regulatory agencies. You know, everything that we give to people goes through strict regulatory requirements, and the whole thing is based on benefit risk analysis. You know, that it's the regulators in the end who assess the relevant benefit risk. Of course, you can never get that absolutely right. I mean, you trial a drug or a vaccine in 20,000 people. When you put it in 2 million people, you know, nothing more may go wrong and so forth. But it's this balance which has really given us these advances in modern medicine that all of us benefit from to a great extent, especially as we get older. It was a very intriguing meeting. A couple of scary things. The scariest thing was that this bird flu, the H5N1, we were so worried about, has probably killed about 1 billion birds, either chickens, that is domestic chickens, in Africa and Asia and the Middle East and in Europe. That's killed them either by the virus killing them or because the birds had to be culled to try and control it. The control measures haven't worked all that well. The virus is still spreading in many parts of Asia particularly, and it's changing all the time. It's mutating all the time. And it's really concerning because, you know, this is a bad virus, and it has infected about 500 plus humans, and of those 500 plus humans, 60% died. And 8 died there were 8 cases in Cambodia this year, all 8 died. So it's changing very rapidly. The Dutch, who have a major influenza program, took this virus, and under very, very high security conditions, they passaged it through ferrets. Ferrets get an influenza pneumonia that's very similar to the disease in humans. And in fact, the first human influenza virus ever was isolated in 1933 by dropping some stuff down from the nose of one of the scientists, dropping it down the nose of a ferret. Ferret got influenza, transmitted it back to one of the other members of the group, Cox postulus. So we had the complete circle. First influenza virus. 15 years after the 1918-19 influenza virus outbreak, we had our first human influenza virus. SARS virus we had out in 2 months. I think a new virus, if you see the movie Contagion, which you should see actually because it's pretty realistic, I think they had that in a couple of days, which would probably be right because our technology has improved enormously since 2000 or 2002 when SARS hit. There's really enormous advances in technology, in diagnostic technology and so forth since then. And even an unknown virus would probably actually be worked out pretty quickly now. If it was one of the major virus groups, which the SARS virus was. It was a coronavirus, one of the viruses that normally cause colds and flu in us, or minor flu. Anyway, so they've taken this virus, they've taken the H5N1 virus, and they passaged it through ferrets, and it's adapted to passage between ferrets. If it spreads between ferrets, it would probably spread between humans. Only 5 mutations, which isn't a lot for influenza virus. So that's kind of concerning. We've got 2 concerns with influenza. Firstly, that H5N1 will change and come across into humans. The second one is that, as happened with the influenza, has its genome organised in 8 bits. So if you've got a cell infected with 2 different flu viruses, the virus is repackaged. That's what happened in 2009 with the swine flu. These were 2 pig viruses, a Eurasian pig virus and a North American pig virus that got together in a Mexican pig. Now, how the Eurasian pig virus got there, I mean, pigs don't normally go on package holidays to Mexico. We're not so sure. But we got a repackaged virus out that then spread very readily between humans. And fortunately, it wasn't too bad. In fact, the sort of age group many of us are in, born before 1950, and many of us had cross-reactive antibodies from previous flu. So we didn't get much problem in the older age group, which is usually the most vulnerable to influenza, of course. So the other thing that's happening, though, is in the pigs. It's been followed by my colleague Rob Webster, who's the great authority on these things, and basically these viruses are reassorting in pigs at a much higher rate than anybody's ever seen. And so there's a good chance that we get another pandemic strain out of pigs. In fact, another virus did come out of pigs recently, only infected a couple of kids and didn't spread further, but it's happening, and I think there's a good possibility we'll get something there. Flu meeting was great. From there, we were in the home of the Knights of Malta and so forth, very interesting. Knights Hospitalier. They came to Malta after they were thrown out of Rhodes. The Turks threw them out of Rhodes. They'd already been thrown out of Jerusalem by the Muslims, and they wandered around a bit, and then I think the Pope or something gave them Rhodes. So they built massive fortifications there. And then they were thrown out of Rhodes, came to Malta, built even more massive fortifications. Napoleon threw them out of there, and then the British threw Napoleon out. So but we traced the hospitalities. We went to Rhodes after that to one of the medical legal meetings that some of you may have even gone to. This one's organised by Eugenia Matrakis, a Melbourne lawyer. And that was interesting. We had Lord Byron came. Lord Byron is a maritime lawyer. He's a descendant of the famous Byron, of course, and not nearly as much of the scapegrace. He's a very respectable man, and Eugenia's husband, David Roylance, who'd been a prominent maritime lawyer, had died in the previous year, and they asked, what would you like from the law firm? Because they were in the same firm. And she said, I want Lord Byron. So he came out, talked about his ancestor. And also Rhodes is evidently the home of maritime law, which I hadn't realised. Very interesting. Interesting for a medical scientist like me to listen to lawyers and to listen to the people in medicine who are much more on the sociological side of things, and hear how different people are asking different questions, approaching different problems, and have different issues. And I find that very, very, very interesting. So we had a good time in Rhodes, and then we went to Dublin, where I was getting the Ulysses Medal. As I'm married to Penelope, getting the Ulysses Medal was big, but it wasn't for my prowess in sailing the Aegean. It was for, because I was involved in the giving a lecture at the reopening of the Dublin Veterinary School at the National University of Ireland. And so the Ulysses Medal is actually named for James Joyce's Ulysses, which I don't know if anyone has anyone read Ulysses? No, not easy. But if you go to Dublin, there are people who are totally obsessed with Ulysses, the novel. And they read, you have to read it with a companion, evidently, because the companion volume has to tell you exactly what was happening in Dublin at the time he was writing, because that totally influenced how he wrote Ulysses, which is why I think many of us found it pretty impenetrable. It wasn't a requirement that I read the book before I went. And so then we came back from Dublin, and that's pretty much the end of my story. I had to go to the Festival Ideas in Adelaide, and I talked there, and then talked in Sydney at the old quarantine station, which has now become a conference centre out on the Heads. And now I'm still trying to get my head back together and finish the book on ruffled feathers. So.
Yes, I'm just, I expected
No crocodile.
to come along here, no crocodile, and go home quite an authority on immunology.
Well, you got another out.
But instead I've been highly entertained and it's been very educational at the same time. So I'm sure that's going to influence a lot of the questions which we'll have now. Shall I up to that?
Peter, you mentioned that a lot of eminent people get Alzheimer's, and it's quite interesting. There was a German medical scientist called Joanna Budwig, and she devoted her life to looking at omega-3 essential fatty acids.
Right.
And believe it or not, she cured many, many people of cancer. Her work was suppressed because she wasn't mainstream. But what she also discovered was that people's brains have a lot of fatty acids in them as a rule. And basically the message is that if you can find the certain foods that have these fatty acids, and they're not easy to get, I go to health food shops and get coconut oil, which is the best of it you can ever get. And people are going to, a number of us here are going to get Alzheimer's, and 1 in 4 are going to get cancer. And I can assure you from my own experience, if you try coconut oil, you'll be amazed.
It's of course one of the things that happened just after we got back is the opening of the new Brain Institute down on Royal Parade. This very, very fine building that's just up Royal Parade from Brain Institute. I'm sure you've noticed it. It's a wonderful building. And there were a lot of people speaking on Alzheimer's there because Colin Masters, who's here, is one of the authorities and done some very interesting stuff. Those dietary sort of issues are discussed, I think, quite a bit, including omega-3 fatty acids. I know Colin's colleague, who's a German scientist. You know, you often get this in science. You know, you have collaborators who are in totally different countries, and of course now they communicate by email. It's a bit of a problem if the emails get into the popular press, as the East Anglia ones did. But, you know. Evidently cholesterol is at the centre of the plaque, the protein plaque, and the cholesterol lowering medications will probably give you some protection.
Maybe up the back here.
Just changing the topic a little bit, talking about leadership in education. Many universities protect their brand, and rightly so, and there are many systems of ranking universities in order to obtain the leading ones. Now, what is your view about the current criteria we have in the different systems? And if you were devising a system, should you want to do that, what criteria would you have?
Yeah, I've always been a researcher and not a professional educator, so you know, I'm talking a bit out of my area, but as a scientist, I would say that particularly high school marks are pretty poor predictors of success. It depends a lot on motivation and so forth, and the sort of kid who gets very good high school marks may not necessarily be a very good scientist, because they're the sort of kid who sort of takes knowledge in and reproduces what's wanted. And if you're going to be a scientist, you've got to be pretty sceptical and disrespectful in some sense. So it doesn't work so well. So I actually like the idea of something like the Melbourne model, or the way the American universities operate, where you take people in who are obviously competent, but you don't judge them for, say, entry to medicine and law and so forth at that stage. You give them a go in a university setting, because universities are very different from schools. The actual rankings of universities that we hear so much about, I'm really dubious about them. I'm pretty unimpressed. I mean, you get rankings for having a Nobel Prize when on campus. I mean, could be brain dead Nobel
Thanks for your talk, Peter. I was really excited that you brought up the conversation. I recently discovered this case and been really impressed by how unbiased and
I hope you're
how
passing on the word.
Oh yes.
Have you sent it out on your LinkedIn site?
I've been tweeting it.
Keep it up.
I will. I was wondering, I mean, you touched on a really important issue, and it comes up again and again, that science and the media, and scientists are really nervous to speak to the media because the media are interested in sensational And
It's a very difficult interaction.
yeah, I was really interested to speak to one of the leading science reporters. I'll say that for the age, because it doesn't get much of a spread in the age. But she actually said that they actually do pick stories that are sensational, and a lot of them tend to be negative. Do you have anything to say about that? Do you have any ideas about how we can change this?
Negative sells, and that's an unfortunate fact. The other problem is, of course, the motive of the scientist and the motive of the journalist is generally very different. The newspaper wants to sell newspapers. So unless it's a really established quality newspaper like the New York Times, which employs a lot of top quality science journalists, it's a very difficult interaction, because you have the discussion, and then with a print journalist particularly, you open the paper the next day with a foreboding sense of horror. Usually it's fulfilled, sometimes not. I discovered, in many cases it's better not to be reported actually, which is kind of sad, because I do believe science communication is enormously important, which is why I started to write books actually. And and sometimes they're after this negative sensational story. I discovered how you deal with it. You just keep talking and you give them lots of alternatives, and they hate it. And they never write anything, they report something else. So I'm quite good at that. If you want to get rid of the television journalists, what you do is you refuse to do the shot in the lab with the white coat and the microscope, or the pipette. I mean, stereotyping just drives me nuts. And it's not, stereotyping in any sense. You have to be the nerdy professor. The other thing you've got to do is try and get them not to call you professor, or tell anyone you're an expert. The best interaction, as far as media is concerned, is with a good interviewer. Robin Williams or John Fane, and then even I've had some good experiences with actually talkback radio guys. And that's the group I'd like to get to, is the talkback radio. But they'll rarely ask scientists on because they feel intimidated. And they also feel that scientists may come across as arrogant or obscure. And that's not good. I think if I were really going after science journalism in this country, as far as the print media goes, I'd go after the throwaway papers, the suburban papers, those people. They're often looking for content. And I'm hoping that the conversation content they'll use and start putting out there. And then, of course, on the web itself. And the conversation things will be picked up by other websites and linked. And so the more you can spread it, the word about it, the better.
Gentleman over here on our right.
I was just wondering, with the pig flus and the bird flus and everything like that, is the way we practice agriculture contributing to the growth and the spread of these diseases, and therefore having a potential threat into the human population?
Yeah, there is some aspect of that, but though actually the most dangerous situation is probably the very traditional thing where you've got pigs, birds and humans living very close together under very warm conditions. But there are certainly agricultural practices that contribute to it. I mean, the fact that we've probably got now 50 times as many domestic chickens in Asia, partly due to the efforts of our own aid organisations, USAID and so forth as well, certainly increases the multiplier effect. It's thought that the mutations in the H5N1 have probably occurred in the big chicken houses. There was a seminal event. In 1997, we saw these people starting to die in Hong Kong. The viruses were coming from the live bird markets. And they eventually got all the live bird markets shut down. They killed everything, and it stopped. But that infection spread south, and it's thought it spread by people illegally moving birds, north-south. There could have been some bird spread too, but there wasn't much in wild birds. Then suddenly, they started to see wild birds dying in Hong Kong, and they got an enormous die-up in Western China on Qinghai Lake. And what they think happened is that the virus got into some big poultry production facilities not too far from Qinghai Lake. So how would it get from a chicken house to the lake? Well, the Chinese also started to breed bar-headed geese. They've got railway workers there, and they wanted to give them a bit of variety of diet, so they started to breed geese. and it's almost certain that the geese got it from the chickens, carried it to the lake. It killed the geese. It killed geese and it killed swans, and but it didn't kill ducks. I mean, the thing about influenza virus in birds is it's carried in the gastrointestinal tract normally, and it's normally a fairly mild infection of birds, and there's a tremendous variety of these things in birds, most of which never cross over into us at all. And, but when you've got a lot of different bird species on a big lake, the virus survives very well in water, so it infects all the species. And so some of the species will be very susceptible, but you know, ducks are as different from swans as we're different from, I don't know, dogs probably. And the ducks didn't get a severe infection, but they carried it. They then carried it west to Europe and infected chicken populations. Got down to North Africa, got up as far as Scandinavia, and so perfect ecological system to maintain the virus. The other thing that does contribute also to the waterbird thing in China and Southeast Asia is if they use the droppings from the big chicken houses and they put them onto the rice field. So you've got water, chicken droppings, waterbirds. Yeah, so yeah, certainly management practices influences it.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Doherty. I'd like to ask you a question about antibody-dependent enhancement, in particular regarding a situation with a patient with confirmed positive dengue 1 and dengue 2.
Yeah.
What would their relative risk be regarding hemorrhaging if the patient came into contact with dengue 3 or dengue 4?
Could you repeat the question?
I'll tell you about it. Yeah, you know, dengue virus infection, dengue breakbone fever, kind of unpleasant infection, mosquito-borne. It's in Southeast Asia. It's in the Caribbean. It comes down into North Queensland. There are 4 different types of dengue viruses. In Southeast Asia, though not in Queensland, you get a condition called hemorrhagic dengue, and that condition comes when you've been infected with one dengue virus, and you recover and you're okay. Then you get infected with a second one, and suddenly you've got a horrible hemorrhagic disease, particularly in children. A lot of children used to die, but the medical people in Thailand and so forth really worked out much more supportive therapy and got them through it, so many children are okay now. But it's thought one of the arguments about what happens, and it's never been totally true, is that the first response creates, the first infection, you recover, it creates an antibody response. Those antibodies are kind of cross-reactive with the second dengue virus, but they help the virus get into the cells and damage the endothelial cells, the cells lining the blood vessels, and you get breakdown of the endothelium, and you get hemorrhage, right? And so the question is whether, you know, if you've had a couple of these things and then you go back into those areas, are you really at risk? I don't truly know the answer. I think if you've had 2 or 3 of the infections, you're at less risk than if you've only had 1. That's my understanding, but I'm not sure of that. There's a dengue, 4-component dengue vaccine is pretty close to being made available. It's been trialled. There's a US Army vaccine that's been trialled. US Army's had a big research institute in Bangkok for a very long time, and of course they want to protect their soldiers and so forth. But they're also much more altruistic than that in what they do. And there's also one coming out of the US National Institutes of Health, where they've used the backbone of the yellow fever virus, which is a very, very successful vaccine, and they've put these 4 dengue types onto the backbone of yellow fever. So we may have a vaccine against this thing. Never seen the hemorrhagic fever in North Queensland, and I think there's just one reason for that. We've never had enough people in North Queensland. My cousin Rolf Doherty, he was the discoverer of Ross River virus, actually. Always wanted to see more people move into North Queensland. He wanted to bleed them first.
Can we make one the last question from the lady in the centre?
Professor, there was an article in the Age this week about a new influenza vaccine that's supposed to be effective against all strains for life. Can you comment, please?
Yeah, I've just written 2 things for the conversation. It'll be in the conversation tomorrow. It'll be the first part tomorrow and the second part on Monday or Tuesday, I think. So if you go to the conversation, there are a lot of things happening with influenza. We really do need some sort of universal vaccine if we possibly can develop one. The current vaccine isn't. It's very specific. It's pretty effective. Not so good if we're older, unfortunately, but always take it, because the statistics tell us that if you take the influenza vaccine, you'll live longer. Probably not because of the influenza vaccine, but because you've got the attitudes. but you wouldn't want to, you might as well hedge your bets and get it. So you should get it. We should get it as we get older. The other thing you should be vaccinated against is respiratory syncytial virus, because you get it from your grandkids and that can kill you. And, but I haven't been, I should be.
Which one was that there?
What's the name of the virus?
Respiratory syncytial, RSV. Also some of the paraflus and the croup virus and so on. Yeah, they all give us pneumonia particularly. I mean, our immune system. I'm putting everyone in this category. As we get older, our immune systems decline along with everything else. So, the universal flu vaccine. Several different types of technologies are being tried. Some are highly molecular. The principal protein on the surface of the virus that the antibodies grab hold of is called the hemagglutinin. The head of the hemagglutinin changes very readily, and that's why we have to keep making these new vaccines, because it changes so that the antibodies no longer grab it and destroy it. Okay, so what one group has done is actually chop the head off, and they've made a vaccine against the stalk region, which is much more conserved. That's one approach. That's not what this article is about. The article was about a T-cell vaccine, which is based on actually work we did back in the 1970s. And where the cell-mediated immune response. How long did you work for that? Who was the one who won the lecture on immunity? You did. Yeah, we can start now. But the cell-mediated immune response, the killer T-cells, which is what I've studied, are cells that are just that. They're killers. They bump off other cells. They can bump off cancer cells, or they can bump off virus-infected cells, very specifically. And this works by, when the virus infects the cell, we have molecules on our cell surface called transplantation molecules. These are the ones that are recognized in graft rejection. Okay. Why do we have them? Well, what they do is they carry a bit of the virus to the cell surface, and then that makes that cell look as though it's a foreign cell, a transplant cell, and we kill the cell. So this vaccine is based on that technology, the one that's been talked about. Now, we've tried these experiments over the years. You get a degree of protection if you prime that response and you get immunological memory, but only against a fairly mild influenza infection. And the problem is that the T cell goes back to what we call memory, your resting state. You have to reactivate it to become one of these killers, and by the time you've done that, the virus has already grown quite a bit. It can give some protection, but when we've challenged, say, prime mice or ferrets that are primed in that way, something like H5N1 virus just blasts straight through it. So I think there's a little bit of hype going on at the moment. And but we actually, that's part of the stuff we're funded to under the from our HMRC on our program grants.
I'd like to introduce to you William Fisher, who's going to thank Peter for us. Linda is the Vice Chairman of the Council, and one of her other big claims to fame, she's also one of the volunteer roles, is the driving force behind all our centenary celebrations, which has been great fun. So over to you, Linda.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
I'm glad that we went away from the idea of asking all our guest speakers this year to turn up in their uniform particular to their role, because Peter may have refused to come in his lab coat and bring his pipette. When we decided on our theme of leadership this year, it was with the intention of looking back at a celebration of 100 years of the extraordinary people that we've had as members through our organisation, and those people that are here now and are still to come. And I think we've been particularly privileged in the guest speakers we've had, particularly with the retired Governor General. We've also had Professor Rosenfeld, as you know, and again tonight we've had Professor Peter Doherty. And each one brought something quite different to the platform. We looked at the role of leadership among men in a very difficult situation, at war, at peace, the types of things they're called upon to do. I thought Professor Rosenfeld was very inspiring in looking at his role as a medico in a hospital and the sorts of things that for leadership. But tonight has been very interesting to me. We've not only heard about that world of immunology and influenza and so on in your particular field of expertise. I was very interested in the very broad range of areas that Peter has commented on. We've looked at agriculture, we've looked at education, we've been reminded about the history of university and how people fought to establish those things. My ears pricked up when I heard the name Laureate, because we tend to think only of that in the context of conflict in the Middle East at the moment, and yet here is somebody trying to establish something with a few little edges that need to be tweaked, but establish something that needs to be preserved for a long time to come. Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. We really did enjoy it. I think I can speak, just judging by the way we've all sat here for quite some time, the number of questions that have come, the numbers of people that have attended. Thank you very much for your time tonight, Peter. We really did enjoy it.